On Friday, I received a text message from a local organizer asking for people of faith, clergy leaders, and friends of the Muslim community here in Philadelphia to gather at City Hall on the south side for the Jummah prayer service at noon. This is the first time that the Muslim community of the Center City Masjid was able to gather together for a prayer service and for a time of worship. They were expecting or worried about people causing trouble. So as I biked downtown, I saw the crowd gathering, men and women, people of all races and ethnicities, people of different means, some with beautiful prayer rugs, some with cardboard boxes, people sharing, wearing masks, maintaining as much distance as possible, but coming together for their time of worship. And I listened to Sheikh Tahir Wyatt give an incredible khutbah homily. And he was telling his folks, when we gather for prayer, we're supposed to be shoulder to shoulder. But because of the pandemic, we want to be shoulder to shoulder, but also leave some gaps. But know that we are shoulder to shoulder spiritually. We don't let anything come between us. When our Muslim siblings line up for prayers, line up in rows, and you're supposed to be as close together as possible, shoulder to shoulder, to not let anything come between you. In Muslim theology, this is to not let the devil, the Satan, come between you. For some of us Unitarian Universalists, we might say this is to not let anything evil, any division, any kind of racism, sexism, genderism, ableism, oppression come between us. During the prayer service, towards the end, when folks are making salat prayers, after one of the revolutions of bowing and praying, there's a time when it comes to just remember the goodness of God, Allah. And one of the intricate details about a Muslim prayer service is that folks will often take one finger, the finger next to the thumb, as the Quran says, in supplication, and to go along with the prayer. There's a few different understandings of what that is and what it means, whether it's pointing at something or to someone, or if it is to remember the oneness of God, the oneness of the Ummah, the Muslim people, the oneness of humanity, some of us UUs might say. And I found that simple ritual made everything else come into clarity for me as I stood guard, wearing my clergy collar and this stole, with my bicycle, making sure that no one would come and try and interfere with this peaceful gathering, with a kind of protest against police brutality, against systemic racism and oppression, in support of Black lives, in support of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and so many others. As I stood guard and I saw the one finger lift up as people were deep in prayer, it felt like a unifying moment. The march through downtown Philadelphia yesterday that started at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Rocky Steps, if you're watching us outside of Philadelphia, and moved down Ben Franklin Parkway that is lined with flags of many nations towards City Hall, felt like a unifying moment, a great moment of oneness, when this group of people was there in what I would call a kind of prayer. That protest is a form of prayerful activism, of prayerful action, as we learn from our Story for All Ages today. And I was struck by the congruity between the khutbah that talked about the Prophet Muhammad speaking of the abolition of isms 1400 years ago, but not the abolition of differences. That in the Ummah, 1400 years ago, there was supposed to be an end to any kind of supremacy between people. No matter what tribe you were from, what your skin color looked like, how educated or wealthy you were, no one was supreme over the other. There was no white supremacy, for example. There was no Arab supremacy. That the goodness of faith, the goodness of God, the goodness of unity and community meant that there were no isms, but it did not mean there were no differences. That even though Muslim theology teaches, Islamic theology teaches that we're all created similarly from the same stuff, the same dirt or dust, we are also created differently and according to the Prophet Muhammad so that we might get to know one another. That we might get to know one another for our differences and recognizing that we are all similar as well. That to just simply paper over the differences does a disservice to how we were created. And that some of us have been granted different privileges based on how we look, based on how we move in the world. But that the point of faith and a community being together is to try and erase that supremacy instinct that many of us were taught to have, and to instead embrace community. And in fact, the only thing that is supposed to separate us in terms of supremacy, making one more than another, is in seeking out taqwa. Islamic theology says it's called God-fearingness, God-consciousness. Some of us might call enlightenment, wisdom, a recognition of our unity, a recognition of our non-duality, of our interconnectedness, as Janet lifted up. That we are created the same, but with deliberate differences, different beliefs, so that we might get to know one another and appreciate those differences, rather than trying to separate ourselves because of them. And that what matters most is how integrated we are into that vision of beloved community. What matters most is how we act on our different beliefs. Do we act to create division, to divide, to dominate? Do we act on supremacy notions, or do we act to create unity? Something like 12,000 people perhaps marching through Philadelphia, wearing masks, trying to be as socially distant as possible, feeling the need to make their voices heard, to protest, to pray, to sing, to chant. Yesterday was a great day for the city of Philadelphia. And yesterday was a day of mourning for me on a small scale, paired with everything else that's going on that I'm grieving and mourning. Yesterday was supposed to be the day that Restoration hosted the Sam and Devorah, I'm blanking on the name, the Sam and Devorah Foundation for Trans Youth was supposed to have their annual meeting here at Restoration. Because of the hard work that this congregation has done on inclusiveness and education and accessibility, we were chosen, amongst all the other places these folks could have gone, to be the host for this wonderful retreat that brought trans youth from around the area, around the nation, to be here. I was really looking forward to this. And that couldn't happen because of so many things. And even if there were not a pandemic, we don't know what would have happened if people still would have been able to gather. With the protests going on, and with what some are calling the riots, as we enter into June in this month of pride, where our theme is about play, I think it's important to lift up that in activism and in protest and in prayer, there is also an element of play. And that if we look back on history and do not take all of that into account, if we look at what is going on in our city right now, in our nation right now, and do not take all of the context and history into account, we miss out on some of the deeper meanings. We miss out on the significance of our Muslim siblings talking about unity. So we learned about the history of Stonewall, and Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. And when I learned about Stonewall much later in life, I learned about the Stonewall protests, the Stonewall movement, the Stonewall Inn. Only recently has it become known more as the Stonewall riot. And the phrase Stonewall was a riot has been lifted up by many of our LGBTQ siblings, especially those who are involved in justice work. When we feel the tension of seeing people march in our streets, I want us to also look at the results that have started to happen here in Philadelphia. From the Rizzo statue being removed, from the pushing back and the discussion about the city budget that funds more and more militarization and cuts essential services, that people are starting to have hard conversations, that the protests, the riots, are making inroads, that the prayers of the people coming together in unity are starting to have an effect. So when we look at the history of the Stonewall Inn and the Stonewall Uprising, the Stonewall riots, we can mourn the violence and the broken windows, the heavy handbags dropped on police cars to break windshields. But I'm struck by the story of the police raid on the Stonewall Inn and all of the backstory that involves the mob and obscure laws and different subcultures of the LGBTQ community having different reactions to whether it was appropriate or not to have a riot. And I'm struck by one of the lesbian women who was being beaten by the police, who turns to the crowd, according to the story, and says, "Are you guys going to do something?" And that clicks everyone into action. That the catalyst and the calling out, "Are you going to do something?" creates this energy that we talked about last week, creates a prayerful protest, creates riots, creates action, creates results. Now, one thing can create something more. But that the Stonewall Uprising, the Stonewall Riot, was not just people breaking things or lighting dumpsters on fire, although that did happen. But there was also a sense of play to it. That people were doing can-can lines, openly hugging, kissing, holding hands, openly being who they were. In a time when it was criminalized to be who you were, if you were gay or lesbian, a time when drag queens were kicked and punched and looked down upon. All of a sudden, folks were saying, this is our street. This is our community. We are who we are. There was singing. There was dancing. It was a riot. It was protest and play. There are lots of different kinds of protest, my friends. You may not be someone who wants to be out marching with the black and brown and white, trans and queer and straight and bi youth who are out there leading the way in these Black Lives Matter uprisings, protesting police brutality, protesting systemic oppression, calling for a new imaginative way to see how we do life. That may not be your cup of tea. You may be someone who's more interested in other kinds of protest. But I want to lift up that protesting involves things that look like prayer, things that look like dancing, things that look like satire of state violence. And sometimes the breaking of windows is held up on the same level as the breaking of bodies, but they are not the same. Sometimes protest looks like providing water and snacks to those who are marching. Sometimes protest looks like play and singing and dancing. I was struck by a moment downtown in the midst of a very tense standoff between protesters and rally attenders in the city of Philadelphia police and the National Guard. In a moment of extreme tension, a sound broke out. And it was a group of young people dancing in a circle to Kirk Franklin's Revolution. If you have not heard Kirk Franklin's Revolution, know that it is a Christian gospel hip-hop song, but I encourage you to listen to it because it's very catchy, and it was the sound of the revolution when we were downtown this weekend. I want to lift up in this month of Pride that play is an important part of all of this. That there is anger, yes, there is hurt, yes, there is fear, yes, there is discomfort, yes, and amidst all of that, people are finding ways to express who they are, to express themselves, and to be playful about it. To fight state violence with dancing, to fight state violence with singing, to fight state violence with satire. It takes all kinds. I think it takes all of us shoulder to shoulder, not letting anything in between, remembering our unity, protecting those who are most vulnerable while they express who they are, remembering that Stonewall was a riot and that progress demands all kinds of action. There are many ways to be an activist. I invite you to find your way this month as we remember all those who came before us. May we find ways to sing and play, to usher in the revolution, to keep our eyes open and to remember our